All right. Well, welcome everyone to the sixth and final meeting of the Fiscal Responsibility Subcommittee. I want to first just say thank you, everybody, for uh, all the time that you've devoted to this, not only during the meetings, but in preparing for the meetings, looking through um, all the public comments, getting feedback from your various constituents, and really providing a lot of insight and contributing to a robust and thoughtful discussion over the last 3 months. It's really been an honor to work with you. I hope you've enjoyed being part of the process, and I encourage you to stay engaged in the process. This is really just step one. If the governor does wind up submitting a proposal to the legislature, there's going to be a lot more discussion over the next few months. And so I just want to thank you all for everything you've done up until this point. It's been really beneficial to me, I know, and to the department as well. So I will start, as always, by reading the statement, and then we will dive into conversation. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. Dominique, do you want to take attendance?
Yes. Okay, I have Karen, Katherine, Harry, Justin, Tara, Michael, Tom, and Chris. Missed anyone?
All right, I think we're good to go. Well, today we're going to talk about our broader policy recommendations. We've done a great job getting into the specifics of the different categories of funding thus far. Thank you again for all your feedback on that. I know the department has really benefited from having all the different perspectives as they started to work towards that draft proposal that we've seen and continue to refine that based on the feedback they've received. We did get a document from Dominique that shows us sort of prompts some questions that we're going to walk through today. We're going to take them out of order for a couple of reasons. One, because different subcommittees have different purviews, they each will focus in on those areas of expertise for them. Because we are the Fiscal Responsibility Subcommittee, we're going to skip down to accountability and reporting. So looking at things from that fiscally responsible taxpayer standpoint. And then we're going to circle back up to some of the others and continue through them throughout the course of today's meeting. And then, of course, we can obviously offer any recommendations on the broader policy objectives beyond those listed here in this document. So we'll be sure to make sure that if anyone has additional policy recommendations they would like us to discuss, we'll make sure we have time to do that then. So if we look at the page 4 of that document at the top, accountability, this actually came from the steering committee, which is, I think, all legislators, or at least predominantly state legislators who meet along the same time frame that we've been meeting and discuss certain things. And a few of the questions that we're going to talk through today came directly from the steering committee, and one of which is what accountability measures should be included in a new funding formula. So thinking about, as we are able to empower schools and school leaders more with driving more dollars directly to the schools, and giving them more flexibility over how those dollars are spent. In response to that, what are some accountability measures that we as a committee would encourage the department and ultimately the General Assembly to consider in a new funding formula? Any thoughts on that? Anybody want to chime in? Anything on accountability metrics? We talked a good bit about some of these things in the outcomes section. And so, the outcomes themselves will hopefully be incentive based and lead to better outcomes. Michael, you got your hand up?
Yeah, so one, I think just spending accountability is key. So we need good information on what's being spent and how. So per pupil expenditure information that separates out state, local, federal funding. I think it's also useful to make sure we have clear information on dollars that go into the classroom versus dollars that aren't necessarily going to the classroom, specifically administrative expenditures. I think having that broken out will be key to making sure that money's actually going to the classroom. So one is just good information on school and district spending. I think that'll be good for accountability. Second, related to the outcomes, we'll need information for the outcome specific dollars to be distributed. And that includes, and in addition, we should have information on instruction time, the content and curriculum, and teacher quality. I think that should all be included as for accountability. And then third is something about we should do regular reexamination, maybe on a yearly basis, on just how effective the formula is at getting the money to the classrooms, to high need districts, to teachers, to supporting students with specific and special needs. I think all of that should be part of the accountability portion.
Michael, I'd like to ask you a question.
I think is that Katherine?
Yes.
Hi, Katherine.
Hello. Good to talk to you again. This accountability, would that come from the Department of Education or the legislature?
So for what my feedback was ensuring DOE is asking the right things from the schools, and that the schools are sending the right information back up to DOE. That's all public and therefore accessible to us and to the legislature, such that if the legislature needs to act, they have the information to act on. If DOE needs to act, they can act. Schools and districts themselves can also react based on the information that they are providing. So transparency should lead to multiple layers of accountability.
Right. Okay. Some of it's built in.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just wanted to understand it.
I would echo that. I think the goal would be that the legislature puts those requirements in place for reporting that goes to the department, but the department would be the one compiling that and making that public for that transparency purpose.
Okay.
Tara? Tara, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. I was off camera because I was eating my lunch.
I called on you at the wrong time.
I'm here, but I wanted to echo a lot of what Michael said. I'm in agreement with. I think when it comes to like the transparency in expenditure reporting, So the federal government now requires districts and the state to report per pupil expenditures. And there is a set way that we do it now. And the department went through a pilot program, you know, with some districts to figure out the best way within existing ways that we report expenditures, all of that. I think that is a really good start. But if we want to tie expenditures into this formula, we struggle with the fact that revenues do not equal expenditures. And we need to keep that in mind. Like, it's really hard within our existing framework of how we categorize expenditures based on the comptroller's chart of accounts. They don't tie specifically back to state revenue or local revenue. They go into one big pot. And so you can't separate them out and say, we spent X on classroom salary increases of state dollars. Like, it just, the way that we report our financials right now don't let us do that. Federal accountability does have, like, we have to keep federal funds separate and report in a very strategic and, you know, way for federal funds. But because state and local are intermingled, I just want to keep in mind that any requirements that really get into like the nitty gritty, we have to kind of fundamentally rethink about how we're reporting our expenditures. And that's a big ask of districts, like their financial systems, you know, how, for many reasons, many accountability systems, not just like reporting to the state on the funding formula. Like, that would be a huge overhaul to redo how we categorize expenditures to report in that way. So if that's something we want to do, that would require, I hate saying it, another investment of resources for financial analysis at a district. You know, that could come with like a computer upgrade program, system upgrade. Just, we need to make sure that everybody can report in that way, whatever way it is we decide. So we have to be able to support that. Does that make sense?
Michael, I'll go back to you if you want to.
Yeah. So I would say, separate from the investment needed to generate reporting, I would say, so that's a big separation. But if we were in agreement that there was certain reporting needed, that certain reporting needed that would be helpful to all of us is a change from what came before, I would say we should agree on that and say, like, that's the ideal, and then make as part of recommendations, look, we need better software anyway. Like,
right. I just wanted to caveat it. It's like, I agree that we should do all of those things. I just don't know that it's practically possible at the moment in the structure that is existing for expenditure reporting.
Real quickly, I think someone just joined by phone after we took roll. Can the person on the phone?
It could be Jim Ethier.
Jim Ethier. We got you. We just wanted to make sure we had you down for the
you
record.
could let me in.
And then would it be possible in this context to say, have data or reporting on the inputs and the outputs? So essentially, I guess, Michael, the question would be to you, would you envision the transparency going down to where those federal dollars are spent versus those state dollars are spent? Or would it be sufficient to say this school gets X, dollars from federal sources, X from state sources, X from local sources, for a total of this amount per student, and then on the other side of the line have here's how this school spends those dollars?
So again, with the caveat of understanding there may be a need to change and upgrade the software and the systems that we have for reporting, I do think it's important, if we have a student-based funding formula, backpack formula, that we have backpack level understanding of expenditures. And so to really get a sense of that, I do think we need per pupil expenditures and be able, again, this is the ideal world, break it down between state, local, federal, district versus school. I think that level of granularity is important to ensuring that the student-based funding formula is working, and it's not about, you know, outside groups or other people bringing in some accountability. It's hopefully about informing all of us, including especially those within the schools, informing them of what's happening with the dollars that are impacting their day to day.
Okay. So essentially acknowledging with the proper level of funding for providing those reports, providing that data, get down as granular as possible to, I like the backpack level as a definition per student. What are the source of those dollars that are funding that student, and what are those dollars being spent on from, you know, for that student? Any
That's
other
right.
thoughts on that? I think the next person was Chairman Brooks.
Thank you. Well, 2 or 3 observations. It's been a couple of years since I've really been, you know, in some of the school buildings, but some time ago, a couple of years ago, the principals had a good idea of what kind of staffing they had. They knew kind of where they were on different levels of expenditures. And with that knowledge, I think it might be good to look at, you know, going back to I think it goes back to the accountability of dollars spent. If each building had a budget that cumulative created a pot of money, and then you could have a pretty good handle on whether it's going to the classroom, and then therefore you can compare it to what's left over from that standpoint. And obviously, you would share things like maintenance and custodial and so on and so forth. But I think that would enhance accountability if the school buildings had and we're doing it now, as I understand it. Unless it's changed in the last couple of years. Another item is that outcomes need to be tied to accountability. If you have a school building that is continually failing, then something has to happen. You can't continually spend money on a failure. You know, those kids got to have some relief. You know, forget the you know, the school system or the staff, but those kids, you know, if they're involved in some kind of a failing environment continually, then there got to be accountability, because those dollars are not being well spent by somebody, and that has the outcome is going to be tied to accountability, and vice versa as well.
I think that's a good point. Any thoughts on that? That we should be able to break this down to the school level and really show a snapshot of each school and the kids in that school beyond just the district level. And we're going to circle back to outcomes too. It's part of one of the questions that the steering committee had for us, but making sure that everything in that outcomes bucket has accountability attached to it. It's not just, we're going to fund these things, but we're going to fund these things if you meet those benchmarks, meet those expectations. I think that's a good point. Karen, you were next.
Well, I think that probably on the accountability side, we're going to have a standardized format. I think it probably, we talk about revenues going to expenses. Normally, when you're preparing budgets, you go expenses to revenues. You capture all of your expenses and then fit them back into your revenues. So I think we probably are going to have a student management system that's going to be linked in some format to our financial reporting. And those two components will be linked, should be linked to academic performance. Mm-hmm. And I think that you probably will be able to see that by capturing. And again, the academic performances that we were looking at last week were only probably in the secondary, 9 through 12. I think there's going to have to be capture some type of benchmarks for academic performance. We we're working, when I left, we were working on capturing this data school by school. Again, you're going to have variances there, and the big variance is going to be on education and experience, and also on the economy of scale on the number of students in each classroom, because the less students you have, the higher the scale of economy. So I think you're going to have to look back at academic performance to make this understandable. And again, I think every superintendent probably in the state has some idea of how to capture accountability, because they have to have it to orchestrate a school system.
Thank you. I definitely think it should be a recommendation that the reporting is consistent. So there's that standardized
Right.
format. So no matter what school or district you're looking at across the state, it's apples to apples. And then I like tying that to the academic performance as well, making sure that it's all consistent.
So Justin, yeah. Just to get back to the fact, one school may not be spending as much money, but they might have a younger staff.
Right.
And another school may have a population that's got doctorates versus, like in a high school setting or in an elementary setting, where population may only have bachelor's and master's degrees and a younger population. So those are things that'll have to be, when we're looking at the apples, we've got to look at all the blemishes in the apple too.
And that the academic performance, as you mentioned, could potentially
be the level
for that. Yep. Yep. Chris?
Yeah, I was just going to say I guess, again, I'm always speaking from a parent's perspective, right? That's the group I represent. So that's always my perspective. That a lot of this accountability is kind of a vague term, especially when we start to apply it to the idea of outcomes, because it's not always so simple as dollars and cents when you're looking at outcomes, because you have parental engagement is certainly something that would contribute positively to an outcome. But there's a measurement for something like that. So rather than thinking of this, at least for me, thinking of this conceptually as a parent, what do I want to see? I'm more interested in transparency than I am of tying a sort of a vague metric to the general concept of accountability. And so when I pull up our district's budget, even at the line item level, it still would not provide enough detail for me as a parent to make any kind of comparative or correlative decisions looking at this. They're really, really broad things. Like I can see things like we spend X number of dollars on a superintendent or secretaries or staff, but that doesn't mean anything to me comparatively speaking. I have no way to say, is that good or is that bad? It just simply is without any form of context. So and I don't know who just said it, but someone did allude to this idea. If we were at least using exactly the same comparison between schools, that at bare minimum would allow me to do some kind of comparative analysis. And then on the accountability side, at least from a purely, dollars in, dollars out perspective, I could go to an individual school if it was at the school level and actually say they're getting, this general outcome with this general input with this number of staff. And I could do at least some kind of comparison from my perspective as a parent to go, this is good or this is bad. But right now, just providing the numbers in sort of line item form without any basis for comparison, frankly, is irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything to me at all. It's just numbers. There's no measure of good or bad. So I guess what I'm really saying is consistent transparency would be what I would want even before the idea of accountability is brought in, is that as a parent, I should be able to log into a district and just drill down to a school. That's less to me important about my individual kid, though that would be nice. So you could see, kids with IEPs, kids without IEPs, kids without, so there could be a general couple metrics that are just about the raw dollars. I don't even know how you would even assign the idea of a successful outcome without taking into account things that are not, they have absolutely nothing to do with money whatsoever. And so I would focus in my head, again, at least conceptually, on transparency, applicable transparency that is across the board rather than a sort of a general idea of accountability. Because I can come up with correlations between things that have absolutely nothing to do with causation whatsoever. You could spend more on building maintenance and all of a sudden, well, I see that this school's performing better. Well, is that the reason why? Is that specifically related? Well, I don't know that it is. So that doesn't help me as a parent. So I would rather see transparency and consistency before we start thinking about the idea of accountability. I guess that's my comment in summary.
I think a good synopsis of that I think Michael or someone brought up earlier is that transparency will lead to accountability in that regard, right? Because if the more transparent you are with how the dollars are being spent, the more you empower parents to know how, to hold those school leaders accountable. Tara?
Yeah, I think of it at least as a dashboard, something simple. Could I see it on a single page when I log into my school's financials? Because I can get that right now, right? I can get raw line items right now. That's not a problem. So in theory, that's transparent, but it doesn't mean anything necessarily. So if I was to think of everything in terms of a dashboard to properly visualize that information, that's a lot more helpful to me as a layperson and as a parent, not knowing the inner workings of everything about school funding. Digestible transparency.
I was literally about to say that word too. I think we should include the word digestible so that it's not just we're throwing the data out there and making it available, but we are doing it in a way that it can actually be understood. Tara, you were next.
Yeah, to Chris's point, I think all of that's really that's an awesome, I'm a huge fan of transparency. I think the struggle in the existing framework that we would have to overcome for that is that, like in Metro, we do have school level budgets. And in theory, I haven't put them on the website this year because I'm new and I just haven't done stuff like that, but that should be available. But in other districts, the central office allocates out resources often based on a staffing model, not their school-based budgeting isn't happening in, I don't know, all but the two biggest districts in the state. So like a school level budget in the way that you're talking about, I don't think that's really, I don't know if that exists in a way that would be easily transferable to like some dashboard or even just posting on the website. I just don't know if smaller districts budget in that way to break it down at the school level. Karen might be able to speak to that for Sevier, but this kind of comes into the question of if we're funding at a student-based level now, are we still allowing districts to allocate out funds the way they always have and allowing that flexibility of funding formula, not a spending plan? If we start getting into how they spend the money and making them report at the school level, we are going to start dictating. So we need to balance flexibility versus, just reporting out what they end up doing, if that makes sense. I don't think I'm articulating that very well. Just the existing structure right now isn't budgeting at a school level for many places, I think.
That's helpful feedback. Karen?
I think that most school districts, and again, for 45 years, I've taught superintendents how to make budgets, so that kind of helps me just a little bit. You have to, first of all, capture your personnel. And the next thing you do is normally you capture by components. You do normally K-3, the 4-6, the 7 through 9, and then the 10 through 12. You break down those components and you pick up your major components, and then you go back, if you have any money left over, to add the niceties. The major expenses that you have for a school district are your operational cost, your capital cost, and your transportation, and those things are your non-classroom expenses. But your classroom is the first thing you do, and then with the leftovers, you do your support. And I'm sure Tara probably does. They do the same thing by school, but most districts have to do it on a district level. And again, because of our method of funding, it has been on a district level rather than on a school level. But also you have to meet maintenance of comparability. So you have to have a comparable expenses at all schools in order to receive your federal funding. So there is a comparability there. I think the big thing whenever you're talking about digestible is most people can digest a number, cash, but they're going to have a hard time digesting the accomplishments unless we find a good way of expressing it of our academic performance. I think that as a parent, that was my hard thing, just to understand exactly what I was being told about the accomplishments of our schools. So I sort of agree with Chris on that line.
Well, speaking of, Chris has his hand raised, so we'll go back to him.
Yeah, this is really an open question, not so much a comment, but are there common and I guess compulsory, so required across a board for every school? Are there required categories, coding, and accounting standards that would allow me, and I've never done this, so it's truly an open question, me to pull one district's numbers and pull another district's numbers, skip the dashboard, skip all that, just look at them right now and know that I'm actually looking at apples to apples? Is that happening right now before anything new changes?
Karen?
It should. You have your budgets are broke down into classroom, support, which is your principals and assistant principals and secretaries and counselors and that type of thing. And then your non-classroom expenses and your capital expenses. Those are the four major categories of your budget. Problem is that we don't always categorize. I don't think that we are strictly categorizing all of our expenses in the right category. I might put it somewhere and Tara might put it somewhere else. And so that's the major issue I think that we'll have to overcome in standardizing this, but also linking it to the student management system. For instance, now all of the components that go into capturing student management. It's going to be very, very, I just hope that whenever we're doing this, that we include data management, because I think data management is going to be an expensive component in this funding formula.
Michael?
Yeah, I think those are all important concerns. Just to go back to something that I was suggesting before, getting per pupil based expenditures and getting that reporting down as kind of a fundamental step, I think will be important. I have in front of me here, Florida. You can go in year by year. I have an Excel document in front of me here, goes school by school for every district and breaks down school cost per pupil, district indirect cost per pupil. Under each of those categories, state and local, federal, state, local, and federal, total costs, it's all here in an Excel doc. Then there's a separate document here that breaks it up by district and state, school cost per pupil, district indirect cost per pupil. As like a first step, I just want to make sure that something like that would be tied in to backpack funding. And I think tying that transparency with how we're going to revise it. And then, yeah, having this question of how we can give schools the resources and districts the resources to have some basic reporting, I think will be important.
Any other thoughts on that? So we want to get as granular as possible at the backpack level, certainly at the school level, but we just have to ensure that there's consistency in that reporting. But if Florida can do it, hopefully at the level they do it, we could at least reach that level. We also want to make sure that we include the academic performance in those dashboards so that we're seeing all sides of that. And, I think to the extent we can make it, to urge them to make it a dashboard so that it is easy to understand and digest and less spreadsheets, the better. Any disagreement with that? Kate?
What I wanted to ask, in that dashboard, they have outcomes as well? The Florida dashboard, Michael?
So I have the link. I dropped it into the chat. You can see for yourself. It's not a dashboard. It's one is by year, it's PDF and Excel.
Okay.
So in my mind, is that ideal? No. But I understand that dashboards are a whole next level of IT investment. I'm not opposed to that. I'm just trying to ask what's the right level of accountability and reporting, and then we can have hopefully another conversation on like how do we package it and present it back to teachers, administrators, legislators, but especially parents.
I think we could look at it in kind of two-step as well. First step is create the consistency in what has to be reported to the department, and whatever investment needs to be made for the districts to manage that data and compile it and submit it in the consistent way. And then in terms of economy of scale, just have the department determine what the dashboard could look like from that data. But if they go into it thinking, we want to be able to make this a dashboard, here are the things that we need to require the departments to submit, not require the districts to figure out how to create the dashboard and submit stuff that's part of the dashboard, but just the raw data so that the department itself could do that for the whole state.
From my end, Justin, agree on all points. Yes.
Michael, can I ask something? In that report, did they do a ratio, student to teacher ratio? Is that how they report salaries, or do they do like teacher assistant ratio? Or is
yes, but that's a separate, those are separate documents, but yeah, it should be on the link that I shared. It's in there. It's just not on the page that I shared, but all of the reporting, funding and financial reporting, there's also reporting on how they calculate teacher salaries and how that relates to the ideal student-teacher ratio. I just don't have a link in front of me, and I know other states do the same thing as well. Because South Dakota, I think.
I think the teacher-student ratio is more important, really, than the dollar figure that you're spending on salaries.
Any other feedback, particularly on the reporting stuff? So I think the consensus is some of the things we just discussed, but reporting itself will lead to accountability. So spend more time on how can we create consistent and understandable, digestible reporting before you get into all the specific details on the accountability metrics. Anything else on reporting or accountability, broadly speaking? If not, let's move to specifically some outcomes questions that I'm trying to get more to the specific things that the steering committee asked us to provide feedback on. So if you look at the bottom of page 3, we've got question from the steering committee. What outcomes would you recommend be included in that outcomes? So think of the pyramid, the bottom is base, then you have the weights for those students that are more costly to educate. Then you have some direct funding grants and things for CTE and items like that. Then you have the outcomes funding at the top, and that's where you can really drive results. a lot of and we discussed this the last couple of times, a lot of the current draft and the discussion has centered around high school. There have been fewer discussions around what outcomes based, what kind of outcomes could we measure and provide in the formula for middle and elementary school. And so I want to open that up to the group to see if you have any thoughts and suggestions that we can offer the department on those two areas. Chairman Brooks.
Two observations. One, the reading standard probably for the earlier grades probably ought to be the most significant outcome standard. How are we doing there? As you move into the middle, I think currently in past number of years, we've had particular grades, particular subject matter, outcomes in reference to multiple purposes. But I think that's kind of on the books. It might be good to talk with the LEAs and with the teachers to determine if that current concept is working, and does it provide the sufficient information to say that a student is competent in math or science or reading or language or whatever it might be, and then take it from there. But it may need to be relooked and reevaluated in regard to the effectiveness on those grades. But the earlier grades, I don't know. It just seems to me that if you can conquer reading skills, the rest of it falls in line. And that ought to be the number one measure of outcome. Are we producing what we need to produce academically?
Yeah, I think third grade reading is that critical benchmark, right? So I've got reading standard for elementary, and then each individual subject matter as you get into math and science and those other subjects for middle school. Is that accurate, Chairman? Any other thoughts on elementary or middle school outcomes that should be considered in that outcomes bucket? Kate?
I think middle school is hard to evaluate outcomes. You don't have tests like the ACT and so forth, but I do think something to consider, and I've called a couple friends in different states and I don't know who does it, is high school ready. So we're talking about workforce and college ready. What about an evaluation if success in high school requires this level of literacy, this level of math? Are they ready for high school?
I like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on elementary and middle school outcome?
The other thing is if you're pushing a lot of money into career training in junior high, somehow you have to measure whether they're, could be ready for high school, of what careers are out there. If you're spending time teaching it, I think you have to measure your outcomes to know if your teaching's been successful. I agree with the concept that you need to introduce it at that point, but I think you have to measure your results.
Any other items on that particular section? All right, let's just open it up now. So we've got several other, I will say a couple of these, just kind of check the boxes off. The department has said that they're pretty good in terms of the policy recommendations they've received on economically disadvantaged and poverty. We've submitted several recommendations on that are broader in nature, can be considered policy recommendations. And then towards the end on maintenance of effort, ADM shifts, essentially some of those local aspects, as we discussed, that's being done as a separate conversation and sort of outside our scope as a subcommittee. But if you do have feedback on maintenance of effort, local funding, local ability to pay, those types of things, I know some have brought up points on that throughout our conversation. The department has actually asked that you submit some of those ideas directly to them, so that can be given to the group that's looking at that piece. So if you have anything around those, please just email Dominique, and she will get your feedback to the proper place on those. But when it comes to sparsities, teacher salaries, tutoring, these K2 weights, funding year, some of these other items in this, I just want to open it up and ask if anyone has things that they'd like to be considered as a recommendation for the department in any of those areas beyond what we've already discussed. Chairman Brooks.
Just as a thought, this is a massive undertaking, to say the least. And it could be the state may need to look at it in a phased in process, that you develop the basic concept, and then in year 2, you then say we've got to have certain standards met. If it's a school building by school building funding or whatever you need to, to verify that your dollars that are being spent as it looks like the multiple, like the weighted concept, like 1.6 is the 0.6 spent for school kids that are socioeconomic or in that particular category. So it may take a while to get all of that set up and accomplished. So, it may very well be something you phase in over a couple of years. This is a very massive, challenging undertaking that the state has begun to look at.
I think just from a basic timing standpoint, and Dominique, you can correct me if I get this wrong, I think the commissioner said if this is, converted all at one time, it would not be until the 2023-2024 school year. So even if this passed this spring in the legislature, the districts wouldn't be required to move to this new model. This coming school year, they would have a year to phase that in. So any thoughts on that timing, whether it should be like an accurate timing potentially, or if there should be even more sort of a phase in process based on that?
I think that should solve the problem.
Okay. Yeah, it would be be a tight turnaround if they were expected to do it this fall, as they're already budgeting. Some of the budget's probably close to done by the time the legislature gets done, right? Any other thoughts on any of these categories that we haven't discussed? Chairman Brooks? Oh.
Just one observation is that just want to emphasize the point again that I think we've reached the point that we need to plug in a lot of extra money. I think we've maximized the funding that we've had. While the opportunity is there, we need to add some money. I know that the group with Senator Frist, his think tank said, let's look at $1 billion. And that may be where it ought to be. If we've got the availability of funds now that are on a reoccurring basis, we need to do it. We need to bite the bullet and plug it in, and let's move up to the next level, where we've moved from the bottom to the middle. Let's move from the middle on up toward the top quarter.
Michael?
Yeah, I'll go through some of these categories really quickly, but follow up with an email. So one is just to echo what some of the folks have said on teacher salaries. I'll defer on the specifics there, except to say that targeting the ideal student-teacher ratio, I think, will be important. Because the question here, are there other policies for teacher salaries? My only feedback there is just keep it simple and easy to understand. On the K through 2 weight, I actually would recommend a different direction. So I keep going back to the Florida example. So Florida has been doing this for a very long time, generally been relatively successful. It's in our neighborhood. They actually target K through 3rd and then 9th through 12th. And so you give additional weights. You basically tweak the base for K through 3 and 9 through 12. And then you keep grades 4 through 8 funded at the base amount. So you just make some slight tweaks there. That I think is a better approach. So that would be my recommendation. They use I'll leave the specifics, but that's, I think, would be good. Completely agree on reading proficiency being a key, the key outcome for elementary school. I really haven't seen much on middle school, so I leave that to other folks here who may have a more expert opinion. And then one final thing on policy for funding year. So again, I'll go back to Florida. They're going to do the full-time equivalent student count. First off, at the state level, based on demographic and school district projections. So they're looking ahead, and then revise it based on actual student accounts in October and February. So to the question of what about fast-growing or quickly shrinking schools and districts, what happens to them? Are they going to get short shrift? I would say by actually having good projections and consistently revising the student count, hopefully then dollars will actually be tied to students, and those dollars will actually be tied to real needs locally.
All right. You gave us a few things to consider here. I'll try to work backwards from them for the group to add anything to that. So the funding, Michael suggests to look ahead, make a projection, then revise that once you get accurate counts, or actual counts, and then over time, obviously, you start to really sharpen that tool, that ability to determine what the projection is itself. Any feedback on that point? Any feedback on the, rather than a K2 weight, move to a K3 weight and then a 9 to 12 weight? So the base is across the board with slight tweaks on the margins on the front and back end of a student's education. Feedback there? Well, you're on a roll, Michael. And then teacher salaries. One of the things that has been brought up is how do we ensure that the funding gets to the teacher salaries? So there have been discussions in the past where the legislature will allocate salaries for teacher, or allocate funding for teacher raises, and it doesn't always flow that way by the time it gets down to the teacher level. Some of that gets eaten up elsewhere, redirected elsewhere. And that was one of the things that was brought up. How do we ensure that when we are intentionally funding increases in teacher salaries, that it's resulting in increased salaries? I think, Tara, you had your hand up first.
I'm actually going to talk about Michael's point first on the enrollment, like the timing for enrollment.
Yep, go ahead.
In Metro, we base our budgets off of projections that are set in January, February. So my schools are all going to get projection enrollments for their school that they will base their budget on to start in August. And then once school starts, we do like a count, obviously every day, but we do like a 20-day count and a 40-day count. And we adjust school budgets based on those actual enrollments. So if they adjust within a certain amount, basically enough to warrant another position or losing a full position, then we adjust budgets up or down. That works for us because we already have the pot of money here. So I'm not sure how we would adjust to actual enrollment versus projections from state money. Like, we wouldn't want to take away money from a district when they've already built their budget off of a projection. So just trying to explain like how the projections work at the school level, but I'm not sure how it would work for the state if enrollment came in so far off of projections. And just to note, projections are not a science at all. We've been thrown for a loop with COVID, so they're all over the place. And then as for the teacher salaries, not necessarily translate, the funding for teacher salaries not translating to pay, I would argue that that was a byproduct of the BEP being inadequate because districts were paying for additional positions beyond the BEP. So perhaps the new funding formula would offer that to not happen.
Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful. Michael, do you want to comment on the back on the funding piece for projections versus revising it for actual? Do you have anything else to add to that?
No, but I don't think that it's an immediate, we move money out based on like October and February counts. But I do think it's important to ensure that if, like, for instance, like we're thinking about if enrollment goes down, is money taken away? I think it's important to recognize that there's the reverse. If we see that there's more students, or we're making sure that money is coming in. So I understand that it's difficult to set a budget for a year and then have dollars shifted based on the actual number of students showing up. But I want to balance that concern with the potential that you may get more students than you need, or that you expected, or really just the original goal here for the funding formula being tied to backpacks. I think we need to keep that focus in mind too. So I completely agree. I don't disagree with those concerns. That's just my general feedback.
Justin, may I make a comment?
Yep,
thank you. I wasn't sure my little hand was up there. Texas currently has a model. Well, it's not really a model. They've implemented in their student-based funding budget, there has to be a certain percentage set aside that will go to the teacher salaries in classrooms, not to fund new positions, but existing teachers' salaries.
Thank you for that. That's a good Texas.
And I have a question for anybody on this panel that would like to answer it. I don't really know who to direct this to, but are benefits, retirement, and insurance calculated into teacher salaries in Tennessee, or is that something that we should request or suggest as part of this funding model?
Great question.
They are included. They are included, but the problem is that all positions are not funded. And
right.
And Michael, back to the salary funds, if a district is having to fund more than 50% of the raise, plus fund the raise for the non-BEP positions, that's why if there's a 2.5% raise, there's only a 1% raise can be given locally. So that, I mean, it's just dollars and cents. But each year and in fact, in January of each year, they make an adjustment for the health insurance benefits. On the growth factor, I think a semi-annual growth adjustment would be a practical component that you could see at the end of the first semester and at the end of the second semester. Make an adjustment. Right now, we do an annual growth adjustment more than, I think, the percentage varies based on the amount of money that we have. But that growth money would be very advantageous to school districts if they could get it semi-annually. So that could be a component that could be considered.
So move the actual kind of recount of the projection to the end of each semester rather than annually.
Right.
Yes, now. Karen, I think you had your hand up. Did you have something else
Well,
that you?
that was what I was.
Did? Okay.
No, let me undo my hand.
Yeah, you're good. I just wanted to make sure I didn't move on to somebody else. If you still had something, Katherine.
And just as a disclosure, I have teachers in my family, so I have a bias toward teachers. Anyway, we're talking a lot about incentivizing all different aspects of this funding model or different areas of the funding model. How about teachers? Can't we incentivize teachers as well as our students? Maybe we could, this is just one idea. Maybe we could incentivize them in a way for excuse me, I'm terribly sorry about that. Incentivize them away for exceptional outcomes, either in their classroom or the school in general. How about incentivizing the school in terms of graduation rates, but that filters down not only to the district, but also into the classroom, to the teachers. I mean, everybody seems to be getting incentives except the teachers. So I'm looking for creative ways to help them increase their salaries.
So consider directing some of the outcomes funding not just to the school, but to the individual teachers.
Yes. Yeah, if they have an exceptional, for instance, if they are involved in CET and they have an exceptional outcome with their students in the CET process, that they're incentivized monetarily. And I'll tell you who does that. I believe it's Florida, Michael, that does that for their teachers. I looked at all the documents you are referencing in all different areas of this funding, and it helped answer a lot of these questions that are currently problematic in what we're doing here in Tennessee, because they do actually get down to the granular level.
I like that one.
I'll add that Katherine's 100% correct. There is an incentive bonus program for teachers who are considered highly effective, and it is relatively generous, if I understand correctly.
All right. Add that to the outcomes piece. We are over time, but give one more minute if anybody has any last feedback.
Can I add something, Justin?
Please do.
We were talking about transparency and all of that sort of thing, and accountability. And I think when we get down to a granular level, parents are part of that equation in terms of funding certain needs that maybe their particular child has. And if there is the ability for a parent to track the effectiveness of these particular weights that their child are being afforded to, I think that that's very important. And if a parent sees over time that their child is not being helped by these different weights, then they can go, that gives them the ability to go to the teacher or to the principal, whomever, and say, this is not working for my child. Let's make a change here and make that a collaborative effort.
I like it. I think that going back to kind of the discussion earlier, that transparency can really put that information at the fingertip of parents and give them resources they don't otherwise have.
Well, one of the things I like about charter and I have family members that teach in charter, is that they are really, at least in South Carolina where my family is, they're very good at I don't see mandating is probably too strong of a word. They do a lot of outreach to get parents involved in the process. And I think what I just suggested is another way, just another way to get parents involved in the trajectory of the education process and how effective it is for their child or their children.
Yes, thank you for that. Kate, last comment?
I agree. The parents are the third leg on the stool here. They're key. But I also think that tutoring for the literacy in grade 3 has to be funded for a certain period of time. Because if you're starting a new program, I think you have to fund it, but understand those schools will have that funding for 2 or 3 years, and then they should have figured out what is holding back their literacy. But I don't know that you can start it requiring that they're literate by 3rd grade without providing funding to support that.
Ongoing funding on that. It's a good one. We hadn't gotten to that one yet. Made that note. Okay. Well, we have, Kate, did you have one last thing?
No, I'm good.
Okay, sorry. We have done a lot of work over the last 3 months. So thank you all for great feedback from your constituents, from other states, from the districts you've served, the experiences you've had. I really think we've helped give some great recommendations to the department. We will continue to provide this information for our discussion today as they work to refine the process. If you are interested, the department would like to invite you to sit in the gallery for the Governor's State of the State address next week. That is 1 week from today, January 31st at 6 p.m. in the House Chamber at the Capitol. If you would like to go, please let Dominique know. Just shoot her an email. This is first come, first serve. It gets a little busy up there, as you might imagine, with that address. But if you'd like to be there to see the governor give his state of the state, which potentially could include a public comment and rollout of what we've been discussing, then please let Dominique know. I know the department would love to have those who have participated in this process to be a part of that if you would like to do so. With that, Dominique, any parting words?
Nope, just thank you all for being so wonderful as I've supported you through this, and I hope that I've been able to meet your needs throughout the process.
Thank you to Dominique. Let's give her a big round of applause. She's done all the hard work.
Thank you
for all of us on this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominique.
Job, Dominique.
It has been a pleasure.
Well, with that, our business is concluded as far as the Fiscal Responsibility Subcommittee goes. But I encourage you all to continue to weigh in on this as this unfolds, hopefully in the legislature, and we do everything we can to ensure that every child in Tennessee is getting the education that he or she deserves. So thank you for being a part of this.
And
Thank
thanks
you,
to you, Justin.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
The easy job. You guys were easy doing all the hard work. So I just run the meetings. But thank you all. We really appreciate everything you've done and look forward to continuing to work with you. Yeah, have a great rest of the day.